So Pam, happy Fragrance Day. It is a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you and get some updates. We're going to really get into the sense of smell in a moment. But before we start, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell the viewers a bit about the Monell Center, please.
Absolutely, Linda. It's always a wonderful opportunity to connect with you on Fragrance Day. I am a smell and chemosensory scientist at the Monell Center in Philadelphia. The Monell Center is the premier institute in the world for studying smell, taste, and chemical irritation. And we are a group of about 110 people who spend all our time smelling and tasting things and learning about these senses, which are so important to our everyday enjoyment and human health.
Well, you spend a lot of time looking into a lot of scientific research regarding the sense of smell. So over the years since the pandemic, we've talked a lot about how smell became an elevated sense. The value of it is so much greater prior to people losing their sense of smell. And you've explained a lot of different nuances within that. So if we could start out with this, since we spoke last, or what is the latest, if you could just share some of the new discoveries or developments that have been found at the Monell Center in terms of sense of smell.
Right. Well, we do know now that the persistence of the loss of smell from COVID is largely due to a chronic inflammation that occurs in the area around where the olfactory receptors and the mechanics of smell take place in the nose.
Okay.
This is important because it helps us understand what might be useful in a therapeutic regimen, but it is a chronic inflammation that's set up, and it is what is largely responsible for people not being able to regain their sense of smell even after a year or two. Now, it turns out that if you look at this in an animal model, even the influenza virus can cause serious disruptions to the olfactory system. Why it doesn't necessarily do that in people is something we don't yet know, but when you infect animals with an influenza virus, you will see changes not only in the olfactory neurons, but the supporting cells. Now, the supporting cells are what are targeted by the COVID-19 virus, right? So there's a lot that we're able to learn by dissecting the system and seeing where these viral antigens actually appear and what effects they have. The other interesting
thing.
Can
I just ask you that one?
Sure.
If you don't mind, I want to just dig in. So why do some people have this inflammation or have the effect of losing their sense of smell? Is that where you were going to go next?
That's the $64,000, probably the $64 million question at this point in time. There may be predisposing conditions. Some people, because of either age or prior insult, may have less capacity to regenerate. So these individuals many people can lose their sense of smell transiently. What we're interested in is why some people don't recover as quickly as others do. And that may be because the system over time and insult, and also just with aging and all of the things that we're exposed to, may lose its regenerative capacity or may reduce its regenerative capacity, so that when it's finally hit with a virus as potent as the SARS-CoV-2, it just can't come back again.
Wow. So some people have lost some level of smell. Some lose it for a very temporary, some for more time. And of all the different variants with COVID, were there many variations that affected the sense of smell? Did they all affect the sense of smell somewhat or not?
It's very interesting. And we've been testing at COVID testing centers, both in Chicago and at the University of Pennsylvania. And we have indeed seen differences as a consequence of the variant. Now, in the early stages, the Alpha variant, approximately between 65 and 80% of people who tested positive had a smell loss. Now, it may not have been a persistent one, but they had a smell loss. And it occurred very early in the course of the infection. By that, I mean, when we were over at the University of Penn Testing Center, I was talking with the nurses who administer the test, and they would tell these young students who had really no other reason to lose their sense of smell, they would ask them if they could smell or taste. And if they said they couldn't, they told them to go right into isolation because they knew that there was no other, that they were obviously positive for COVID at that point. As we move through the variants, the Delta variant produced smell loss, but in a fewer number, lower prevalence of people. And the Omicron, even with the subvariants, people are losing their sense of smell. It's probably around 15% of people who get tested regularly. And also it appears later in the course of the infection. So whether it's, we still don't understand the mechanism, it's having probably the same impact, but why it's acting slower and it's not working to disrupt smell for so many people is a very interesting question. Obviously, we're glad of that, but it highlights lots of research questions that can be probed in the future to understand the impact of viral, infections on the sense of smell.
And one other question, which always comes up in the land of fragrance, is if you do lose your sense of smell to any degree, are you still, how do you endorse, or do you find that repetitive smelling, testing exercises can help you recover or rejuvenate in any way?
That's a very interesting question, Linda, because currently, one of the only recommended treatments for persistent smell loss is to do something called olfactory training. And you've probably seen this advertised. People can buy essential oil kits. They can make their own from spices that they have in the kitchen or personal products from their bathroom. And the idea is that you will intentionally and mindfully try to smell these materials twice a day for about 30 seconds each, sometimes identifying what you're smelling or what you remember that to have smelled like. Amazingly, there have been very few randomized controlled trials investigating who this works for and who it doesn't, because there is spontaneous recovery. And so one of the things we're very gratified for is that funding agencies are now looking at this very seriously and saying we need to understand when this works, for whom it works, and maybe why it works so that we can understand it better. We were granted a grant from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is a special foundation that involves patients in designing research and trials, very much interested in including the patient voice into what is important. And what we did with that grant was we developed the first US-based survey of smell and taste loss, and we put it out online. We were all guessing about how many people would respond to this, and we were hoping for at least 300 responses. Some people said, well, maybe we'll even get 500. In 2 weeks, we had over 6,000 people respond to the survey. Wow. These are all people who had lost their sense of smell due to many different reasons. Some had traumatic head injuries, some had post-viral infections before COVID, some were COVID related, and some were congenital. They were born without a sense of smell. We've learned so much from that survey that we did, as well as the listening sessions that we did with a subset of the participants afterwards, that I think is really valuable information to know just how incredibly disruptive this is. And I might add that obviously people worry about safety and they worry about social interactions, but a lot of people talk about missing being able to smell their favorite scents or smells in life and how important that is to them.
Yeah, I've spoken about this a lot, but we have found without question, not only is the sense elevated, it's gotten like a new level of respect in terms of fragrancing yourself personally, wearing a personal fragrance, or bringing fragrance into your home environment or spa-like, and how transportive it is. So yeah. For the world of fragrance, though, we're really sad that it came up with a lot of basis in something that was, a terrible, traumatic thing for the entire globe. There have been some positives. Is there anything else on the COVID related? Because I wanted to go to the other subject matter we were going to talk about with emotion.
Right. Well, I think with COVID, the one thing, as you mentioned, it has done for us is it has raised the consciousness of how important the sense of smell is in everyday life. We also are thinking more towards some of the underlying mechanisms and how we can use what we know now about the sense of smell and the funding that's directed towards it to help people who experience smell loss from many different causes. And so it is the silver lining to a very dark cloud, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I know you'll keep us updated. I think you've explained how it's gone in different directions since it all began. So we'll leave it at that and await updates, which we'll share with our entire viewership through our newsletter, et cetera. One other subject that you and I touched upon when we saw each other in person for the first time in the last year was the connection between the sense of smell and emotion. So I, along with the entire industry, spoke all the time about how different fragrances targeted a memory of your mother, your grandmother, your father, your first date, your beautiful vacation or whatever. But since the last couple of years, things went in a new direction of research. And I know that was by both fragrance houses as well as brands to find a connection scientifically between an emotion and a different scent. What have you found, Pam? Have you progressed? Do you have any insights or things you could share on that topic?
So, emotion and smell has always been linked in literature, in the popular press and everywhere that we can think of. Everyone has a story about how emotionally evocative that is. One of the goals now is because we know that when people lose their sense of smell, they very often experience depression and to some degree, even maybe some cognitive difficulties. And what we think is there's a very important bidirectional influence. Not only can sense produce emotion, but when the emotional center isn't stimulated by olfactory input, that may cause other dysregulation in the central nervous system. And that's in the cortex. And that's something that's very important now that we're looking at many people who may have persistent smell loss. How is that going to affect their cognitive function, their emotional functioning in the future? And we'll be taking a really good look at that over the course of the next 5 years to see if there are changes in that. That's why it's so important for people who have even lost their sense of smell, but not completely, that they keep trying to smell things, because we do believe that for some people, this will work to continue to stimulate the olfactory limbic circuit and perhaps produce those kinds of cognitive and emotional function that may otherwise go a little bit awry because of the loss of smell.
It's very, very interesting. There is so much AI, artificial intelligence going on in so many different businesses. And in the fragrance planet, that is becoming something a lot of perfumers are using as an incremental tool besides their fabulous creative sense. So I believe the future is really going to show that, or they're looking to find the connection between a specific scent and the emotional reaction, not just in terms of sexual attraction, but also a sense of well-being, a sense of invigoration. And these are things we all thought about. I mean, when you go to the spa and you smell that eucalyptus, you really get a certain feeling. So I think it will continue to progress. Will that be something Monell will be involved in as well? Because we have a lot of people who are in the biz who would really like to connect.
Yes, very much so. I mean, there's a lot of effort being put into understanding sort of population responses to different types of fragrances. Now, whether we can link that to the chemical structure or whether it truly is in perception itself, those are some of the gaps in the research that we don't know just yet. But we've often stayed away from, and and I know having talked to many industry folks over the years, of wanting to say that a particular scent could act in a therapeutic way, because everyone is sort of pulled back from not wanting to be regulated like a pharmaceutical, right? But I think we're missing a huge potential, therapy for a lot of people by not recognizing the potential power of different olfactory materials to have these effects, and not wanting to look at them at a deeper physiological basis, because people were afraid of how that would be interpreted.
Okay, well, there's always going to be more research on this. And I said this every year. This is actually the 6th Fragrance Day since we started in 2018. But
Wow.
I do not believe that it was a trend. I truly believe that the lifestyles of people have been adjusted for so many different reasons that are very positive and very sadly negative. So that we'll be talking about, the sense of smell, forever and ever, as we say. We really appreciate your time. We love when you share updates on the research. Before we go, is there anything else you think is a topic we should hit?
I think we've done a good job covering the latest and the greatest, but it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Linda, especially on Fragrance Day.
Well, happy Fragrance Day, Dr. Pam. It's a pleasure to see you, and I hope we'll get to see each other in person as well.
Very soon, I hope.
Have a great day.